Imagine yourself under the scorching sun of the Syrian desert, when a young woman with black hair and bright eyes hears, for the first time, the stories that circulate through the tents and palaces. They say that she is descended from the ancient Parthians, warriors of the Iranian plateau, and perhaps even from the Seleucids, heirs to the conquests of Alexander the Great. If you love learning about remarkable lives like hers, subscribe to the channel, like it, and comment on what surprises you most about the origins of a queen. Zenobia was born around 240 AD, into a tangle of clans and tribes vying for influence at the crossroads between the Roman Empire and the Persian world. Her family proudly claimed to have Parthian blood, running through their veins, the same blood that had challenged Rome in epic battles for centuries. But there was still a whisper. She might have been linked to Hellenistic dynasties, remnants of Alexander the Great's generals, which gave her name an echo of Greek civilization and ancient prestige. Imagine a little girl running through the stone courtyards of her home, watching servants bring in tablets engraved in Greek and Syriac, learning from an early age to read tombstones that celebrated elders and local gods. Her older relatives told of a golden eagle flying so close to her on the day she was born that it nearly blotted out the sun, and the local druids interpreted the flight as an omen. The child would one day raise Palmyra, the pearl of the desert, to the heights of great empires. It was in this mix of myths, royal lineages, and aspirations for power that Zenobia grew up, absorbing tales of heroes and plans for diplomacy in a language that mixed Syriac and Greek. Every palace lecturer who taught her history reinforced the idea that she had something more, a grand destiny, born of origins that crossed seas and mountains. But the true proof of this lineage was not just in the scrolls or the family celebrations. It was in how she would turn that heritage into courage to rule. Palmyra, the pearl of the desert, was much more than sand and caravans. Imagine a vibrant oasis, where white marble columns gleamed in the sun and caravans laden with spices, silk, and amber arrived from every direction. As Zenobia grew up, she watched her parents and relatives negotiate with Roman merchants from the west and Persians from the east. At every turn, she learned the value of diplomacy, how a simple nod could be worth as much as a drawn sword. The markets of Palmyra were full of color, and sound drums rang out at feasts honoring the sun god Balshaman, and storytellers gathered under tents to recite Hellenistic epics or local legends. It was there, amidst all this hubbub, that Zenobia realized that power also came from information, from speaking several languages, knowing different customs, and understanding trade routes. When she first entered the city's great council hall as a teenager, everyone stopped to listen to her perfect Greek and her pointed questions about taxes and caravan safety. Palmyra lived within the tenuous sphere of influence of Rome, but its residents were proud of their unique identity, a fusion of Eastern and Hellenistic traditions that made the city rich and multicultural. Zenobia absorbed every detail: the way gifts were offered to travelers, the religious ceremonies that combined animal sacrifices with star readings, and even the secrets of storing water in the scorching summer without wasting a drop. And it was in this fertile environment that she began to draw up the first plans for a strong government. It was not enough to simply keep Palmyra prosperous. It was necessary to make it respected by everyone, from the neighboring tribal clans to the Roman Senate itself. When Zenobia entered the grand audience hall, little more than a curious young woman, she could hardly have imagined that her political destiny would be sealed there. It was in this cedar-paneled space, decorated with Persian tapestries, that, on a scorching day, she met Odaenathus for the first time. He, the governor of Palmyra, had a reputation for being a skilled strategist and for maintaining peace in the region by balancing Rome with the nomadic tribes of the desert. Upon greeting her, Odaenathus immediately noticed her intelligence. Zenobia spoke with authority about trade routes, taxation, and local alliances. The court murmured at the sparkle in her eyes, for it was unusual for an Eastern courtesan to be so resourceful in politics. Some older sages even whispered that she carried a fragment of the spirit of her Parthian ancestors, always ready to defend their autonomy. The marriage of Zenobia and Odaenathus, then, was much more than a union of hearts. It was a silent treaty between tradition and vision of the future. With the alliance consummated, she gained a new role, not just that of the governor's wife, but that of his chief advisor. Together, they spent nights discussing fortifications for Palmyra's walls, studying maps that showed how to reinforce caravan security, and even devising laws that would give the people a voice in local assemblies. Soon, Zenobia found herself walking alongside Odaenathus on inspections of the desert frontiers, listening to reports from tribal chiefs, and even conversing with Roman centurions who patrolled the area. Every step she took along the dirt roads served to cement her image, a leader attentive to detail, capable of uniting such disparate peoples under a common purpose of prosperity and protection. But the true test of this partnership would only come after the tragic assassination of Odaenathus, when Palmyra was orphaned of her most important defender. The widow, with unexpected courage, assumed the regency in the name of her young son, Vabalathus. It is at this crucial moment that we begin to see the fearless ruler. She was becoming emerged as the sun rose over Palmyra on the morning after Odaenathus' funeral. Its citizens found not a destitute widow, but a queen in the making. Zenobia dressed in purple and gold, colors that symbolized both mourning and power, and as she ascended the pulpit in the royal hall, she spoke in a firm voice, "In the name of our son Vabalathus, and for the good of us all, I promise to honor my husband's legacy and protect the city." In the months that followed, she turned every decision into a show of authority. She organized new council sessions, inviting not only the Palmyrian nobles, but also representatives of the Bedouin tribes that crisscrossed the dunes. Under her direction, traveling courts were established to settle land and trade disputes, preventing bloodshed and maintaining the flow of goods along the desert routes. Zenobia did not limit herself to governing from opulent rooms. She rode on horseback and walked the walls of Palmyra, ordering reinforcements and repairs where soldiers and craftsmen spent their days together. She encouraged the opening of schools where young people learned Greek, Syriac, and Persian, for she knew that knowledge was the key to strengthening the cultural independence of her people. At night, in the palace halls, she read financial reports and audited accounts, a rare detail among monarchs of that time, showing that Palmyra's prosperity came from careful and fair management. Meanwhile, he sent messengers to neighboring cities, offering alliances and exchanges of military knowledge. In each correspondence, he emphasized that Palmyra was no longer a simple protectorate of Rome, but a rising power capable of deciding its own path. This bold stance, a mix of diplomatic tact and unshakable firmness, made even Roman generals wonder, was Palmyra preparing for something even greater? And indeed, Zenobia's heart beat faster with ambitions that reached beyond the city walls. She dreamed of extending her influence far beyond the caravans, but to do so, she would need a strong army and strategic allies. And so, under the silent glow of the desert stars, Palmyra began to prepare for the conquests that would change the map of the East. Under an amber-tinted sky at dusk, Zenobia gathered her most loyal commanders in a tent adorned with Persian rugs and maps spread out on cedar tables. There they plotted routes that led from Palmyra to Damascus, crossing valleys where the wind told stories of past empires. She, dressed in the white linen cape that gave her grandeur, spoke calmly. "Each city we conquer will be another link in our alliance of peoples. I do not come with blood to trample lives, but with justice to integrate them into our great project." With that, her army, made up of Palmyrian soldiers, allied tribes, and even disillusioned Roman veterans, set out on the march, flying dark blue banners embroidered with the son of Balshaman. When they reached Damascus, there was no prolonged Siege, Zenobia's reputation as a just ruler and her skill at negotiation made it easy for the walls to be breached with little or no fighting. The locals, tired of high taxes, welcomed her into the squares, singing songs in both Greek and Syriac, and offering her bread and dates as a sign of welcome. On her way to Jerusalem, she demonstrated sensitivity to the beliefs of each community. Instead of punishing those who had supported Rome, she gathered Jewish and Christian leaders in a large hall, where she promised to respect their religious rights. This political generosity became a legend. It is said that she walked among the ruins of the temple, asking for blessings from the elders, and that she even allowed masses to be held in newly rebuilt churches, ensuring peace between believers of different faiths. But the climax of her campaign would come in Egypt, the heart of the Roman granary. The journey across the desert to Alexandria was arduous. Supply caravans staggered in the heat, and water shortages nearly forced a retreat. But Zenobia ordered ancient wells to be drilled and improvised cisterns carved into the rock, inspiring her men with speeches about a greater destiny. Arriving in the Hellenistic capital, she entered ceremoniously, seated on a silk-draped litter, greeted by Greeks and Egyptians who saw the Queen of the Desert as a liberator, not an invader. In just 3 years, Palmyra had extended its borders from the Orontes River to the banks of the Nile, a feat that echoed throughout the Roman world. But there was another trump card it would use to cement its authority and project its face into every market: coinage and the power of propaganda. In the dim light of dawn, Zenobia summoned the kingdom's goldsmiths to the finance hall, whose walls were lined with crimson velvet and subtle gold. There, amid hammers and chisels, she dared to engrave the most audacious of her symbols: her own face in elegant profile, crowned by a diadem of laurel leaves, next to the effigy of her son, the Bellotto. Each coin represented more than monetary value. It was a manifesto of power, an itinerant message that crossed borders. As the caravans left Palmyra carrying spices and silk, they scattered these coins as well, and in every foreign market there was talk of the Empress of the Desert. At the gates of Damascus, travelers proudly displayed the tempting silver pieces, and on the quays of Alexandria, Greek merchants exchanged them as relics of a sovereign who had conquered cities without prolonged war. Soon Zenobia's face replaced the old imperial images and local transactions, whispering to anyone who dared to look, "I rule here." Zenobia's propaganda went beyond cold metal. Poets and painters were hired to recite verses in public squares and carve bas-reliefs on pillars, narrating her rise and the pact of justice she offered to each people integrated into her nascent empire. At public festivals, pronouncements echoed between Corinthian columns, recounting how she would protect caravans from sandstorms and ensure that every grain of wheat reached the granaries. This dual strategy, coin and art, strengthened the sense of unity among the conquered cities. With each new coinage and each celebration in the public square, Zenobia not only reminded her subjects that they were ruled by a woman of vision, but also sent a veiled warning to Rome: the time for the Western Empire to dictate had reached a turning point. As the hammers in the workshops sounded like a silent war drum, Zenobia was already contemplating her next step: to establish a truly multicultural court, where Greek philosophers, Aramaic translators, and local priests would come together to create laws and literature that would perpetuate this new era. And it is precisely this cultural mosaic that we will see in the next chapter, as we explore how her court became a hotbed of ideas and knowledge. Under the soft glow of alabaster torches, Zenobia's court throbbed like a kaleidoscope of voices and wisdom. Imagine long marble galleries where on one side, Greek philosophers discussed the ideas of Plato and Aristotle, and on the other, Syriac scribes transcribed local myths onto meticulously rolled parchments. In one corner, priests of the sun cult chanted hymns to Balshaman. In another, poets recited verses about the stars that were said to have guided the destiny of the Queen of the Desert. Zenobia, wrapped in a cloak embroidered with Parthian and Seleucid symbols, walked between these discussion tables as if visiting a knowledge fair. To the young students who came from far away, she offered scholarships and access to the greatest librarians in the region. This is how Palmyra became more than a trading post. It became an intellectual hub where Greek, Latin, Syriac, and even the Persian of the ancient emperors were taught. This fusion of traditions led to surprising innovations. It is said that a Palmyrian astronomer, drawing on both Ptolemy and Persian astrology, predicted with rare accuracy the arrival of a sandstorm, saving crops and further strengthening the belief in royal protection. Philosophers, under the patronage of Zenobia, wrote treatises on law that blended the Roman Senate and tribal customs, proposing a code of justice that would reverberate throughout the East. Throughout the banquets, the walls of the hall were illuminated by panels painted by artists hired directly from Alexandria, scenes of caravans crossing deserts, but also of female guerrillas marching alongside soldiers, exalting the figure of the queen herself. And each time Zenobia raised her glass of palm wine, she invited diplomats from Rome and Persia to toast the new harmony of knowledge. But this cultural flourishing did not go unnoticed in Rome. While Palmyra celebrated the union of peoples under the aegis of a courageous woman, rumors began to circulate in Aurelian's palace. How long would this empire of the desert tread on the sacred grounds of Rome without suffering retaliation? As torches flickered in the hall of embassies, Zenobia secretly gathered her most loyal generals and chroniclers. The decision was made. Palmyra would no longer accept orders from Rome. Instead of sending annual tributes to the emperor, she would prepare a formal declaration of independence, the first by an Eastern queen against Roman power in centuries. At dawn, messengers set out to spread the news. In palaces, markets, and caravans, it was proclaimed that Zenobia was Empress of the East and that all her domains now formed a free state, equal in dignity and power to the Roman Empire itself. This audacity sparked debates in public squares. Some praised her courage, others feared Aurelian's wrath. The Roman legions, warned days too late by the inertia of local officers, reacted with fury. But Zenobia did not rely on words alone. She sent instructors to retrain veterans in Parthian shock tactics, strengthened walls with extra towers, and stationed archers and casemates dug into the rock. At each training session, a single motto rang out: "To defend Palmyra is to defend our honor." As soon as the rumor that the emperor was marching east arrived, there was already talk of siege maneuvers, treacherous alliances with nomadic tribes, and battles that would shake the dunes. Tension was at its height. Would this be the time for final war, or would there be room for last-minute diplomacy? Under a sky thick with dust clouds, Aurelian's legion charged across the dunes toward Palmyra, their armor gleaming like a sea of shields ready for the charge. At the front, Zenobia positioned her units cunningly. Swift camels served as scouts across the plains. Archers lurked behind rocks, and sappers dug ditches to slow the enemy advance. When the Romans finally charged the walls, they found themselves under a hail of arrows and quicksand traps, tactics inherited from the ancient Parthians, who had taken their first casualties before the siege had even begun. The siege, however, was relentless. Aurelian ordered the construction of mobile turrets and catapults that hurled boulders the size of ox carts against the fortified gates. At dusk, the city shook with each impact. But even so, Zenobia encouraged her troops, walking along the walls, to touch the tired faces of the defenders and promising, "Every grain of this sand is my refuge. I will not yield an inch." Still, the siege dragged on for days on end, exhausting supplies and testing everyone's endurance. As supplies began to run low, once firm alliances proved fragile. Tribal chiefs, fearing Roman retaliation, whispered surrender agreements in neighboring tents, and trusted men failed to return to the ranks. Sensing treachery in the air, Zenobia held a final war meeting, drawing up plans to flee into the heart of the desert. But the following dawn, the queen was surrounded near Bostra by Roman detachments led by Aurelian himself, in the mosques of Palmyra. Even before Islam existed, the main cult was dedicated to Balshaman, the god of the sky and storms, whose symbol, the winged sun, shone on stone altars. Zenobia took part in these rites herself. Offerings of fragrant incense and chants echoed as she, dressed in ceremonial robes embroidered with gold, asked the priests for protection from sandstorms and bountiful harvests. But her faith was not limited to the local pantheon. As Christianity advanced in the East, she demonstrated religious diplomacy. In Alexandria, she allowed Christian bishops to hold services in newly renovated churches, granting them immunity from taxes. It is said that during a sermon by Paphidius, Zenobia sat discreetly at the back of the church and allowed them to praise Christ in peace, a gesture of tolerance that charmed both Jews and Christians, strengthening her image as a just ruler. But at night, when she entered the Temple of Bel, she whispered ancient prayers in Aramaic, mixing devotion to the sun god with salutations to the stars, as Chaldean astronomers had done for centuries. This fluidity of faiths made Palmyra a spiritual haven where caravans of pilgrims would stop to pray and seek multiple blessings before moving on. Study room lit by flickering candles, where monks and chroniclers of later centuries leafed through parchments and debate. Who really was Zenobia? Some portray her as a fearless heroine, a symbol of resistance against the yoke of Rome. Others, inspired by the bias of her imperial patrons, cast her as an ambitious traitor, thirsty for power. In the Middle Ages, Byzantine accounts portrayed her as the serpent of the desert who defied the emperor, reinforcing the narrative that a woman should not rule. In the Renaissance, Italian writers revived her story in plays, celebrating her courage, but also emphasizing her tragic fate as a moral warning against mortal hubris. In the 19th century, with Romanticism on the rise, European poets idealized her as a muse of freedom, an exotic queen whose verses extolled her Parthian blood and the vision of an independent East. This was the time when academic Augusta Murray proposed that Palmyrian coins had been minted to finance female expeditions, a theory that has now been discredited, but which shows the fascination that Zenobia exerted in the following centuries. Today, historians search through archaeological fragments, coins, and Latin and Arabic texts for traces of her true face. Was she the pragmatic politician we know, or a figure mythologized by legend? This tension between fact and fable keeps alive the debate about the legitimacy of her actions, and reminds us that, behind every historical record, there are always those who tell and those who want to erase certain details. Imagine yourself in a Renaissance studio, where a keen Italian painter mixes pigments to portray Zenobia on canvas. She appears in a draped dress, her hand firmly on her scepter and her eyes turned to the horizon, a symbol of strength and mystery. This is just one of the many artistic echoes that her figure has left throughout the world. In Baroque Europe, operas were composed in which the Queen of the Desert was transformed into a tragic protagonist, torn between love, honor, and ambition. The librettos described in great detail her wanderings through the sands, the rituals in the temples of Balshaman, and the solemn moment when she was proclaimed Empress of the East. The audience, immersed in dramatic arias and chorus, glimpsed, even without having ever set foot in the desert, the grandeur of her reign. In modern literature, her name has come in the form of historical romance. Authors have pored over lost manuscripts, creating fictional dialogues in which Zenobia discusses philosophy with Greek sages at nightfall, or plans military strategies by candlelight. Readers feel transported to cedar palaces and halls decorated with Persian tapestries, walking alongside the heroine as she grapples with dilemmas of power and loyalty. Contemporary cinema and TV series were no exception. Directors filmed recreated sets in huge studios, artificial dunes, simulated temple ruins, and massed armies to showcase the grandeur of their campaigns. Each frame reinforces her image as a woman ahead of her time, leading troops and dictating diplomacy with equal mastery. To this day, art scholars study the nuances of his official portrait by studying the coins and bas-reliefs of Palmyra. It is fascinating to see how, in each period, artists chose to emphasize a different aspect, sometimes his exotic beauty, sometimes his firm grip as a ruler, sometimes the almost mythical aura of someone who dared to defy Rome. On the streets of the cities that were part of her kingdom, sculptors erected statues in the central squares. In some, Zenobia appears mounted on a chestnut horse, evoking her role as a military commander. In others, she holds an open book, recalling her passion for culture and knowledge. Every detail, from the drapery of her dresses to the firm features of her face, was designed to reinforce distinct qualities: courage, wisdom, justice. Even in Rome, on the curve of an old triumphal arch, some claim that fragments of an inscription remain, now incomplete, where her name appears among those of generals and emperors. This remnant reminds us that, for the empire that defeated her, her presence was so striking that they had to erase her almost completely, but they were unable to erase the era Narungan around her. Over the centuries, commemorative coins, Renaissance medallions, and even modern postage stamps have featured her image, the Queen of the Desert, as a symbol of female power and cultural resistance. In museums, her coins are displayed alongside Roman statues, highlighting the contrast between conquest and independence. And when we see, today, artistic reproductions on murals in cultural centers in the Middle East, we know that Zenobia continues to live on in the collective memory, inspiring those who seek an icon of leadership and autonomy. Today, when we look at the streets of Palmyra, now preserved by archaeological ruins, we see not only the remains of columns and mosaics, but a living legacy that resonates in debates about leadership and gender equality. Zenobia stands as an example of a ruler who, in the 3rd century, challenged patriarchal norms by taking charge of a multicultural state, showing that competence and vision have no gender. At conferences on history and international relations, her name appears alongside modern queens like Elizabeth II and Indira Gandhi, pointing out how women can wield military and diplomatic power with strategy and sensitivity. Feminist activists cite her in articles to illustrate that even in ancient societies, there was room for strong female voices, and that these voices were erased or distorted by dominant narratives. In the world of arts and media, recent documentaries have introduced young people to not only palaces and coins through online videos, but also to Zenobia's own surprisingly progressive decisions, such as the introduction of mobile courts and the promotion of bilingual education. These educational projects, inspired by her model, encourage literacy programs in rural areas, while valuing local cultural diversity. Even in public policies in Middle Eastern countries, there are those who refer to the spirit of Zenobia when debating regional autonomy and cooperation between neighboring nations, remembering that diplomacy based on mutual respect can be more effective than the imposition of centralized power. Finally, in virtual museums and exhibitions, young people around the world click to enlarge images of their coins, reading captions that tell how a woman dared to expand borders and reform laws. And so, from the heart of the desert to the screens of their cell phones, Zenobia's story lives on, an invitation for all of us to reflect on courage, justice, and the power of diversity. If this journey through the life of the Queen of the Desert inspired you, don't forget to leave a like, comment on which aspect caught your attention the most, and subscribe so you don't miss our next episodes.